Hello everyone and welcome back. 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. This is Jiwon and you are listening to Understanding Korea one story at a time where we talk about Korean history, culture, and the very specific ways they quietly shape our everyday lives. Today's episode is a companion to this week's newsletter. And I say companion very intentionally. Not summary, not audio version of, but companion. Like a good travel buddy who takes a completely different route to the same destination and shows up with different stories. The newsletter this week was about a book I found by accident. It's called 아프면 보이는 것들. I would translate that as what pain makes visible. And it's an anthropology book about pain in Korean society. 13 researchers, 13 kinds of pain. One question running through all of it: whose suffering gets taken seriously and who doesn't? In the newsletter, I wrote about postpartum wind, the humidifier disinfectant disaster, and infertility, all centered around the theme of care. Who gets it? Who doesn't? What happens when it fails? Today, we are taking a different door into the same book. We are going to talk about HIV and stigma, the Sewol ferry disaster, and a group of workers you might not have heard of, called 조선족, Korean Chinese caregivers, whose labor quietly holds up a big part of Korean healthcare. The thread connecting all three: whose pain gets believed, whose suffering gets a name, gets resources, gets taken seriously by the people and institutions around it. So, if the newsletter was about care, this episode is about recognition, about what happens when pain is not just felt, but sorted into pain that counts, pain that embarrasses people, and pain that gets pushed out of view. Okay, let's go. Before we dive into the stories, I want to give you one concept that will make everything else click. It's called medical anthropology. And I know two academic words back to back, not a great start. But stay with me because this is actually really intuitive once you hear it. Here's the difference between a doctor and a medical anthropologist. A doctor looks at a sick person and asks, what is happening in this body? A medical anthropologist looks at the same situation and asks, what is happening between this body and the society around it? Let me make that concrete with an example that has nothing to do with Korea. Think about burnout. 5 years ago, even 10 years ago, I'm burned out was not a medical statement. It was something people said to explain why they were tired and couldn't focus. HR departments didn't know what to do with it. Doctors sometimes shrugged. In 2019, the World Health Organization officially classified burnout as an occupational phenomenon. The exhaustion didn't suddenly appear in 2019. People had been experiencing it for decades. What changed was whether the system was willing to name it, treat it, and take it seriously. The gap between suffering that exists and suffering that gets recognized is the gap medical anthropology lives in. And this book maps that gap in Korean society. It takes 13 different kinds of pain and asks, is this visible or invisible? And if it's invisible, why? Who benefits from that arrangement? Another way to put it is this: some pain gets a diagnosis, some pain gets an apology, Some pain gets nothing. That's the lens we are using today. Keep it in mind. Alright, first the story. If you've watched the Korean dramas, and I suspect many of you have, you've been seeing how Korean culture responds to illness within a community. Someone collapses, everyone mobilizes. Someone is sick, everyone shows up with food. There is a genuine warmth in how illness is handled within the family, within close knit groups. But here is the question this chapter asks: what happens when the sick person is someone the community has already decided doesn't belong? Let's talk about HIV in Korea. And let me say this first, because it matters. This chapter is not mainly about HIV as a medical problem. It's about what happens when a society turns an illness into evidence that someone is morally suspect or socially out of place. HIV arrived in Korea in the 1980s. And like in many places, the early framing of the disease attached it immediately to specific groups, to gay men, to foreign nationals, to people already considered outside the social mainstream. In the United States, the early AIDS epidemic was called gay cancer in news coverage. Korea had its own version of that story. What's striking is that, unlike in many countries, the framing in Korea never really got dismantled. HIV is still widely understood socially as a disease of the outside, of foreigners, of gay men, of people who somehow invited this. Here's a fact that surprised me. South Korea is one of the few OECD countries where new HIV infections have been increasing rather than decreasing in recent decades. And yet, public health campaigns around HIV remain minimal. Because to run a real public health campaign, you have to acknowledge who is actually at risk. And doing that would require a kind of social honesty that hasn't happened yet. The chapter centers on a specific case. In 1999, a man living with HIV in South Korea was criminally prosecuted for potentially transmitting the virus to others. Now, think about that for a moment. If you get the flu and pass it to a colleague, you are not taken to court. If you have a strep throat and your whole family gets sick, no one calls a lawyer. We don't generally criminalize illness transmission because we understand that sick people are not weapons. But HIV is different, not medically different. It's actually harder to transmit than many common viruses. What makes it different is what it represents socially. Drawing on the anthropologist Mary Douglas, the chapter explores how societies organize fear around contamination. The things we fear most aren't always the most dangerous things. They are the things that seem to threaten boundaries, the thing that cross from one category to another in ways that feel wrong. In Korean society, HIV carries that kind of symbolic weight. It's not just a virus, it's a symbol of transgression, of sexual boundaries, of the line between insider and outsider. So when someone with HIV exists in public, the response is not primarily medical, it's social, it's about containment. Fast forward to 2020, COVID 19. A cluster of infections is traced to nightclubs in Itaewon, one of Seoul's most internationally connected neighborhoods, and also home to some of the city's best known LGBTQ venues. What happened next was something the researchers had been watching for a long time. Korean media coverage of the Itaewon cluster rapidly became, specifically, coverage of gay men. Contact tracing became, for many people in the community, a terrifying exercise in forced outing. People who hadn't disclosed their sexual orientation to their families or employers suddenly faced the possibility of that information becoming public through disease surveillance. And some people chose not to get tested, not because they didn't care about public health, because they were more afraid of what the test would reveal about them socially than of what the virus might do to them physically. That is what stigma does. It does not just cause emotional pain, it actively makes public health worse. It pushes people out of the system and into invisibility. It makes illness and the people who have it disappear from the data. And when pain is invisible, everyone suffers more. So this chapter is not just asking how does Korea treat HIV? It is asking something larger. What happens when medicine exists, treatment exists, but dignity still does not? The stories in this book keep coming back to that idea from very different directions. The HIV chapter asked what happens when a sick person is turned into a threat. The next chapter I want to talk about asks a different question. What happens when an entire community's grief is treated as a political inconvenience? Okay, let's talk about April 16th, 2014. For listeners who might not know this story, here is the most important thing to understand. Sewol was not just a ferry sinking. It became a national argument about whether the state had failed its own children. A passenger ferry called the Sewol capsized off the coast of South Korea. 304 people died. The majority of the victims were high school students on a school trip. The ship went down slowly enough that rescue was possible, but the response failed catastrophically. The Coast Guard was unprepared. The government's crisis management collapsed. Children were told to stay in their cabins and wait for help that didn't come in time. In Korea, Sewol is not history, it's still present. It's the reason you will see yellow ribbons in Korea more than a decade later. Yellow, the color of the life vests the students were wearing when they were told to wait. It contributed to the impeachment of a president. It changed how Koreans talk about the state, about trust, about who is responsible when the system fails. But here's what this chapter does that I found genuinely new. Most discussions of Sewol frame it through the language of trauma, the families, the survivors, the psychological aftermath. And all of that is real and important. This chapter reframes it using a concept called social suffering, and the difference matters. Trauma, the way we usually talk about it, is something that happens inside a person. It's a wound in individual psychology. You treat it with therapy, with time, with support. Social suffering is different. Social suffering is what happens when the damage is disputed not just inside a person, but across the relationship between a person, their community, and the state. When the harm was created not just by an accident, but by systems, by institutions, by decisions, by failures of accountability. For the families of Sewol victims, grief was not the hardest part. The hardest part was that the grief had to prove itself. The government's initial response was not accountability. There was confusion, deflection, dispute over the official death toll, dispute over the causes. Families who had just lost their children found themselves in the strange and brutal position of having to argue that what happened was a failure of the state. That is exhausting in a way that ordinary grief is not. Grief is already its own full time occupation, but grief that has to simultaneously justify itself, that has to show up at hearings and press conferences and official inquiries to insist that what happened actually happened and that someone is responsible, that is something else entirely. It is grief plus labor. It is loss plus performance. The families spent years in vigil in Gwanghwamun Square, a symbolic civic plaza in central Seoul, where major protests, vigils, and public demands for accountability often take place. People sometimes asked, sometimes not kindly, why they were still there. Why couldn't they move on? The answer this chapter suggests is that moving on was something the state was offering as an alternative to accountability. Accepting compensation meant, legally and symbolically, closing the case. And closing the case meant accepting that the suffering had a price, and the price had been paid, and the matter was settled. And they weren't willing to do that. This is not unique to Korea. In many countries, states try to manage suffering through compensation, and compensation can quietly become a way of closing the case before accountability feels complete. But Sewol shows this with unusual clarity. The families were not refusing money because they were irrational or political in some abstract sense. They were refusing the idea that grief could be settled before responsibility had been named. One last thing about Sewol, and then we will move on. In 2016 and 2017, South Korea saw the largest sustained public protests in its modern history. Millions of people, week after week, holding candles in the streets, calling for the impeachment of President Park Geun-hye. The Sewol disaster was part of why. Park Geun-hye's whereabouts during the critical 7 hours when the rescue window was open were never fully accounted for. What she was doing while children were waiting to be saved became one of the most damaging questions of her presidency. The families of Sewol victims were among those who showed up week after week in Gwanghwamun Square. Those protests are usually discussed as political, but I think the Sewol chapter adds another layer. When millions of people show up, week after week, in the cold holding candles, there is something in that persistence that goes beyond the strategy. It looks to me like a collective refusal to be unwitnessed, not just to change this policy, but see what happened, acknowledge it, don't make us disappear. That is social suffering refusing to stay private. Last story, and this one I want to flag as preview because I'm going to write and talk about it much more in the future. Today is just the introduction. It's about a group called 조선족, and if you don't know that word, don't worry. I am about to explain it. 조선족 refers to ethnic Koreans who are Chinese citizens, many from northeastern China, with roots in migration during the colonial period. They speak Korean. They carry Korean cultural memory. In many ways, their history is deeply intertwined with Korea's history. There are roughly 2 to 3 million Joseon족 people. Tens of thousands of them live and work in South Korea, drawn by economic opportunity in a country that is, in many ways, culturally theirs, and in many other ways, legally and socially, very much not. Now, a quick note on Korean hospitals, because this is where the chapter lives. In the United States, when someone is hospitalized, their day to day physical care is handled by hospital employed nurses and nursing assistants. There is a system. It's imperfect, but it's institutional. Korean hospitals work differently. The bedside caregiver, the person who helps with meals, movement, bathroom, comfort, all the intimate physical labor of being sick, has traditionally been the responsibility of family or of a privately hired individual. This role is called 간병, and it is not typically a hospital job. Families arrange it and pay for it themselves. That system works because someone is willing to do it. And a large and growing part of that labor force is Korean Chinese women, ethnic Koreans who hold Chinese citizenship, many of them from communities in northeastern China that have been Korean for generations. And here is where it gets complicated and honestly uncomfortable. Korean society has a layered relationship with Korean Chinese people. On one hand, there is a rhetoric of kinship. We are the same people, same blood, same language, same roots. This gets invoked genuinely sometimes and very instrumentally at other times. On the other hand, Korean Chinese workers hold a different legal status than Korean citizens, different visa categories, different access to social protections, and in the workplace, the same blood logic often functions not as a shield but as a pressure tactic. Because if you are family, you are expected to give care without complaint, to go beyond your contract, to observe the emotional weight of the work because that's what family does. But you're not compensated as family. You're not protected as family. The kinship claim is activated when it's convenient and set aside when it's not. The chapter looks at how this plays out specifically in hospital care work. Korean Chinese caregivers are essential, genuinely structurally essential to how Korean healthcare functions. And yet, they are socially undervalued and legally underprotected. Their labor is everywhere and nearly invisible. There is a term for this: racialized labor, the idea that certain kinds of work become associated with certain kinds of people, and that association then gets used to justify lower pay, lower status, lower protection. The work isn't less skilled or less important. It's just done by the wrong people, by the logic of the system, and so it doesn't count the same way. The first two stories I talked about were about people whose pain became stigmatized or politically inconvenient. This story shifts the focus slightly. It asks, what about the people whose labor keeps care possible, but whose own vulnerability remains invisible? We've been asking all episode, whose pain gets seen, whose suffering counts. Korean Chinese caregivers are not primarily patients in this story, but the logic is parallel. Their labor is necessary, the warmth they provide, the physical, intimate, daily work of keeping sick people comfortable and cared for is real. And it is made invisible by the same mechanisms that make other kinds of suffering invisible. The assumption that certain people are supposed to give without receiving, to care without being cared for, to be present without being seen. I said I would write more about this. I will. The question of whose labor makes Korean warmth possible, who is actually doing the caring, under what conditions, with what protections, feels like one of the most important questions about Korea today. But for now, I just wanted to name it because once you see it, it changes how you see a lot of other things. Okay, last few minutes. Let me pull this together. Today, we talked about 3 stories from a book I cannot stop thinking about: HIV stigma in Korea and what happens when a society turns a sick person into a symbol of danger rather than someone who needs care. The Sewol ferry disaster and what it means when grief has to prove itself before it's allowed to be grief. Korean Chinese care workers and how the labor of caring can be made invisible even when it's everywhere. And here is the one thing I want you to take away from today. If we want to understand a society, really understand it, past the surface of its food and its dramas and its economic achievements, follow the pain. Not who is sick, not the disease statistics, but whose pain is believed, whose suffering gets resources, gets recognition, gets taken seriously, and whose pain is handed back with a shrug, a settlement offer, or simply silence. Korea is not unique in this. Every society has its version. But what I love about this book is that it looks at Korea with enough honesty to map the gap, case by case, story by story, without flinching. If any of this made you curious about the book itself, it's in Korean and has not been translated yet, which is genuinely a loss. You can find my deeper dive into the postpartum wind, humidifier disaster, and infertility chapters in this week's newsletter. Link is in the episode notes. And one small heads up, next week I'm taking a break for my daughter's spring break. I'll be back on April 16th. Hopefully a little more rested, a little more recharged, and with a few more things I have been quietly reading and thinking about in the meantime. Thank you so much for being here today. Take care and see you in 2 weeks. 오늘도 들어주셔서 감사합니다. 다음에 만나요. Bye!